Greetings, friends, family, enemies, and strangers of all kinds. Welcome back to Extra Milestone, your weekly Cinemaholic spin-off film anniversary show, and all-around rollicking good time where we go back in time to discuss the classic films that have made the cinematic landscape what it is today. I am your host, Sam Noland. I host this show and others on the Cinemaholics Network, and I am a busy man, but not nearly as busy as the man that you're probably here to listen to, or one of them at least. It is the host of the Cinemaholics main show and man about the internet. It's you can hardly go more than a second without running into something that he's done. It is Jon Negroni. Welcome back, John.
Before running into something I messed up, probably. Hello, you can call me Rashomon.
Yes, I was hoping you would say something like that. I'm a big fan of it. And we have, joining Extra Milestone for the first time ever, it is Ryan Oliver. Welcome, Ryan, to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be on.
I'm glad to have you on. And we're going to talk about a pair of very exciting and very different movies today, as has been the case recently on Extra Milestone. We've had a lot of weird combinations of movies, which amuses John to no end, I can tell.
Yeah, this is not a double feature I'm personally a fan of, but I'm here for Kurosawa. You guys can do your little fun and games afterward if you want.
Fair enough. And I should mention right up top at the beginning of the show that we're actually celebrating not one, not two, but 3 milestones in this general area. We're going to start by talking about Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, celebrating its 70th anniversary. And then we're talking about Jim Sharman's The Rocky Horror Picture Show, celebrating 45 years, one of the most famous cult movies of all time. And finally, I didn't tell him I was going to do this, we're celebrating the 30-year anniversary this upcoming Tuesday of Jon Negroni's birth.
Oh, boo, boo. They don't need to know I'm 30. I mean, that's probably obvious at this point with my voice being all hoarse.
One of us in the 30 club.
Oh, my back. My posture's like Ryan's.
I'm the one with a back injury right now, so don't you be... I'm old on the inside, John, but
I'm surprised your shoulders aren't injured. What with carrying Extra Milestone on them for so long?
Well, almost all of the episodes except for the apartment. But you and Julia Tatey did a wonderful job, and I should mention that I think you've mentioned on the show that you were born in 1990, John, so I'm not divulging any confidential information.
Yeah, sure, fine. But if my identity gets stolen, Ryan Oliver is going to be the first person that I suspect.
That's fair. That's
heard
totally
it here
fair.
First. I love it. All right, we are off to a nonsensical start, as is often the case when I run this little show of ours that we've concocted over the past almost 2 years. Oh my goodness. It's been a long time, hasn't it, John?
Ah, wow. Yeah. Seven Samurai. That was 1954. And that was the spring, correct. I want to say.
That's correct. That was our 3rd episode. That was April of last year, celebrated 65 years. And now we're going a little bit further back in Akira Kurosawa's career to 1950, before Seven Samurai, before Kurosawa had kind of been officially cemented as one of the greatest directors of all time, I think. We are, as I mentioned earlier, talking about the 1950 classic Rashomon. Which is a hugely influential movie and has actually had kind of a narrative technique named after it, the Rashomon effect, which involves subjectivity and stuff. We'll get into all that over the course of this conversation. But first, what I'd like to hear from Ryan Oliver, I'm very curious. How did you first discover Rashomon, and was it early in your Kurosawa education, or did it come a little bit later?
Oh, it was absolutely early. It was the first one of his movies that I saw.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I watched it. The first time I saw it was in college. First time I had heard of it was from a review in. I don't even want to say the movie yet because I know we're going to be doing recommendations later. So I don't even. But I'll save that. But I had read that this movie had a Rashomon-like tone, and so then I at the time I didn't know of it. So I looked that up, and coincidentally, I think maybe like a year or two later, I found the Criterion DVD at a pawn shop in my college town. So I picked that up and I watched it immediately. And yeah, I was completely floored because I had never, at that time, just early college, never really seen a movie quite like it. So that was the beginning of my Kurosawa education.
That's fascinating. It's always interesting to hear like the gateway that people have to this brilliant director. John, I'm curious, was it sort of the same deal? Was this one that you instantly took to?
Very similar situation. Although this was the second Kurosawa film I saw, because I had seen Seven Samurai at this point on the Criterion collection via Hulu. But it wasn't that long afterward that I saw this. It was 2008, I want to say, and the only reason I remember is because I had just watched Vantage Point in the theater, and kind of similar to Ryan, I had heard comparisons and perspective and stuff like that compared to that newer film at the time, being very hearing about the Rashomon effect and how it was a similar thing with things like Fight Club and unreliable narrators. And yeah, I was like last year of high school, first year of college that year. So I remember being very hungry for new things. And by new things, I mean old things that I didn't know about yet. Yeah. And I was kind of aware of this. I was obviously aware of Kurosawa. So I was ready to dive into it. And I've dived into it a bunch of times since. I don't revisit it a lot. I've only seen it 3 or 4 times, I want to say. But every viewing is as rich as the last because, as you mentioned, it's so impactful. I mean, if you've seen movies, then you kind of have seen Rashomon to an extent, or at least this in terms of it being such a foundational film for the way filmmakers tell stories about unreliable narrators and criminal justice and perspective and everything from Sidney Lumet to, even going into Spielberg and George Lucas, whatever you want, take your pick. The cinematic landscape owes so much to Rashomon. It's not even funny.
It is not even funny. It's actually quite serious and educational. And it's fascinating to hear how we actually have wildly different experiences of first discovering this movie. And this movie might be one of the single most unique journeys I've had with a movie. I first saw it junior year of college, and it's conveniently my third Kurosawa movie. So we have a first, a second, and a third covered on this podcast. I watched Yojimbo first, weirdly enough. I can't remember why exactly. That was just kind of the first one I felt compelled to dive into. And this is just after finding out who Akira Kurosawa was and deciding to really take those steps into the esoteric caverns of cinema that I have yet to emerge from since, and I'm happy to remain here. And I watched Yojimbo, and then I watched Seven Samurai, and then I think a matter of days later, I watched Rashomon. But this is a time, and this is 16-year-old me. I've changed dramatically since then. This is a time when I did not have my own expendable income, nor did I have the wherewithal to try and track down movies in an honorable way. So I would find versions of older movies online without having to pay for them. I know.
Here's a confession.
I'm not making any bones about it. I have not done it in years, but I used to do it on the regular. And this was one of them. But weirdly enough, I could not, and I didn't realize this when I started it, but I found a version like a bootleg version that had been overlaid with an entirely different score from like Beethoven.
Oh, wow.
Completely covering up like
this?
a lot of the dialogue. I know it's one of my greatest regrets to this day, because I remember watching this and thinking something is weird about this. The music doesn't fit at all. Not realizing, of course not, you moron. You're watching a fake
it sounds,
version of
though,
a movie.
Sam, that to alleviate your guilt over this, you found a newborn baby abandoned and decided, you know what? This baby represents my redemption. And so, am I the only person who saw this on the big screen, by the way?
Actually, no.
Okay.
I want to. That's part of my journey. I do want to make it clear. I did find a baby, and that baby grew up to be Adonis Gonzalez. So I think it all worked out very nicely.
He's now running for president of the United States.
That's correct,
so,
and I think
full circle.
I think it has a semi-decent chance. So I'm excited to see how Adonis fares.
That's an inside joke for our patrons who they know what that's about.
I hope they do. Yes, it's one of our many running jokes. And yeah, so I watched it, and I remember at the time thinking like, I don't even, because I realized halfway through this isn't the movie. I'm watching a fake version, but I finished it anyway because I had already started it. And I decided, okay, I'm not going to rate this because I didn't technically watch it. A year later, I watched the real version. I watched the Criterion Blu-ray, which I still have, and fell completely in love. I was just amazed by it. And then a year after that, I got to see it in a film class in a theater, which was awesome. And I think I've told this story on the podcast, but in case I haven't, it's one of my favorite stories that I have with Anthony Battaglia, who's been on Extra Milestone, former co-host of Anyway, That's All I Got, where we were walking to my class, and it was one of those things where we showed a movie every week and would like take notes on it and discuss it afterwards, but we didn't know what it would be until we got to class. And so we get there and we're standing outside the door, and I look in and I see the Blu-ray start screen for Rashomon, and in the middle of Anthony's sentence, I said, "Oh my God, we're watching Rashomon." I said, "To hell with you, Anthony," and walked away. And I yelled it really loud. I yelled an expletive that I don't want to repeat on this podcast, but
in college,
I know I was a rowdy boy, still am. And I'll bet if you ask someone in that class, they would be able to remember, because I remember getting a big laugh. Like, I didn't even realize until after I got in and sat down how loudly I had yelled it and how excitedly I sprinted into the theater to try and get as close to the screen as possible. And I loved it just as much. And then that was 3 years ago. And I also am sort of spacing out viewings of it. And then I rewatched it just earlier tonight, and it was just as good.
I do want to do one more flex on that, though. When we showed it at our discount theater while I was a projectionist.
Ooh.
So I was like 17, 18
Fancy.
at the time. I got to actually like work with the film itself and cut it and everything. And to this day, whenever I'm like, okay, I got to cry on cue, whenever that happens, I think about that moment, and then the tears start to roll up because like
euphoric tears, I assume.
Oh, they're real. Yeah.
Very
nice.
Nice.
The drip is real. Yeah.
Some strong flexes coming from both of you regarding the experience of watching this movie. I'm jealous.
Oh my, yeah, we all have it's that's the beauty of cinema, is that we all have very unique journeys with it. Now, we're going to sort of be getting into the plot as we go along, but I want to just get a line from each of us at the beginning of this conversation. We'll start with you, Ryan Oliver. What do you think, if you had to boil it down to like a couple of sentences, if that's even possible, what do you think is kind of the thing that makes this movie so rewatchable and so endlessly true to the human experience? Now, I know I'm sort of going right for the meat of it, but I think this movie really deserves it.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, you pretty much laid it out there. It's almost impossible to do, but I think what makes it inherently rewatchable is that because you're dealing with an event from 4 different people's perspectives, all of which differing, not only do you find different things or things you may not have noticed the first time, but your, cinema being subjective and this, you know, if you watch it at different points in your life, you know, you might find yourself on a different side of one story or another. And I think that, if anything, I think that's what makes it the most rewatchable, is that, you know, your perspective changes along with this movie that is already varying in its perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really indelible attention to detail here, where not only are we seeing these actors portray different versions of the same event more than one times, they're kind of playing different characters depending on who's telling the story. And I think that's a remarkable feat of acting and directing by Akira Kurosawa. John, I gotta know, what is the thing that makes Rashomon as brilliant as it is?
Well, there's so many things. When I look at this film, I tend to compare it to, as we've already mentioned, Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. And I look at Seven Samurai and I think that movie really appeals to like the heart. Like it has like this thirst of, you know, warriors and action and heroism. And it's very, you know, it's very symbolic of that sort of emotion. And then Yojimbo is a little different. Like Yojimbo, I always feel like it really appeals to the mind and the details and all of its little technical quirks. And then with this movie, it appeals what I think most to the soul.
Yes, I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah, this is the soul part of like this unofficial trilogy, I think, even though these movies are spaced so far apart. And I think the reason is because, to what Ryan is saying, you rewatch it and at first you think that you're paying attention to what's different in all of these stories, right? You're like, okay, so obviously these accounts have subtle differences. And the first time you watch, you're kind of like, well, who's right? And that's really the question you're asking. Then when you watch it the second time, you start to look for what's the same between the stories. And you feel a little bit more of like a successful detective in that way, because then you pick up certain things that are easier to accept as meaning in the film, like something that Kurosawa is intentionally trying to say. I think the main thing is the fact that all of the accounts agree that the woman has a dagger. I think that is a very important detail, because no matter what interpretation you take, just the existence of the dagger and what she may or may not do with it creates the truest sense of this being a tragedy beyond the death of one man. So it's little things like that. Like the more you rewatch it, the more you're kind of like, you obviously pick up on some of the easy things, like, okay, clearly the bandit is sort of full of himself, but then you pick up on other things of like gender identity, gender conforming to gender roles, and, you know, how black and white the world seems to be, but at the same time it's not. And you sort of chase after any sort of morsel of meaning that makes you feel a lesser degree of existential dread, because when you watch this movie, it's hard to be like, man, nothing's true, nothing, you know, you can't believe anything anybody says. Like everything we perceive through our eyes is unreliable. And the more you watch this movie, the more it feels like we're sort of asking Kurosawa to tell us his truth of what he thinks of this. And you kind of have to come away from it believing that there is a hopeful ending, but there's also a less hopeful acceptance of the past and the present being very dark. So it is brilliant, to answer your question.
It really is. No, yeah, there are so many different ways to explain the brilliance of it. And I want to get back to what you were just mentioning about the existential dread, but I feel like maybe it might be necessary to sort of give a basic idea for anyone who doesn't know. What's the deal with Rashomon? Well, I'll tell you. So Rashomon is kind of a flashback within a flashback. It starts off in this dilapidated old temple, Rashomon Gate, and it's raining out, and the rain in this movie is unlike anything you've ever seen. It's actually tinted with ink because it's actual water that they just were making with a hose. So the budget on this thing is pretty flimsy.
Well, then also it didn't look as good. The cinematographer wanted Kazuo Miyagawa. He wanted to make sure that the rain wasn't clear, right? And so that murkiness really enhances the film.
Yeah, it sets the tone right away that this is really just dreadful in every sense of the word. And the world itself is just sort of upheaving its very nature to express its own frustration at this. And what we see is a conversation between three men. There's a lumberjack played by Takashi Shimura. There is a priest played by, let's hope I pronounce this correctly, Minoru Chiaki. I am positive I got that wrong, so I apologize for that. And a guy. Do we ever find out what his deal is, or is he just sort of wandering around?
Oh, like the common folk guy?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think he's just supposed to be like an everyday villager, so it's sort of like interested in the gossip of it all.
Yeah. Yeah, he shows up there and sees these other
he's
two.
Like a beggar, is he?
Yeah, I got the sense that he's just sort of like looking around for stuff, just sort of wandering, just a little bit of a vagrant. That's probably not the important part. But says, "What's the matter? What are you so sad about?" And the two of them proceed to tell the story of this sort of hearing/trial-esque experience that they went through earlier that day, where the lumberjack Takashi Shimura recounts the story of going into the woods and seeing what appeared to be kind of the remains of a murder. There were clothing and weapons and jewelry strewn about, and in the middle of it all is a dead man who's been stabbed by the looks of it. And what we see is the three different accounts by all three of the individuals involved of how it happened, including, and this is the thing that every time someone watches this for the first time, they're kind of taken aback by, the spirit of the murdered man himself. They bring in a medium, which I remember the first time watching this thinking, this is really strange. And they have this actress who's channeling the spirit of the guy, and they dub the actor's voice over it, and it's really obvious. So I remember that got a big laugh in the college class I was watching, and I was like, no, this is awesome. Come on now. And what we see is that all three of the stories, while similar in some ways, as John mentioned, they're also very different. And the thing that I noticed around the third viewing, I really should have noticed it the first time, but all three of them tell their own story, and it's clearly to sort of save face and to make them look like they were in the right and they were justified. But they all confess to being responsible for the murder, which just goes to instill this sense of human despair in the two men who are telling the story within the framing device later on. And that's I think that's kind of part of the key to this movie. I'm curious, Ryan Oliver, what do you make of just the intense levels of depression that specifically the priest, but also the lumberjack exhibit to the commoner who hears the story from them? Like, what do you think that is sort of trying to communicate? It's a tough question, I know.
It is certainly a tough question. And what it's trying to communicate, I can't say. I don't know. Honestly, I really don't know. Other than just trying to make sense of it, other than trying to just make sense of, just make sense of the story. And then the story, of course, shaking kind of all of their faith in humanity, and just this level of, sheer confusion. Because like you laid it out pretty perfectly, because each story having each story making the person telling the story to be in the right, but then also confessing to the murder. And then it just adds to that further confusion. And then there's the line, God, I forgot who says it. But it's the one that really stuck out to me. And I actually thought of it kind of in just, our current climate, and just with so much misinformation. It's the line of, I don't care if it's a lie as long as it's entertaining. Which to me was like the more than any perspective of the story, like the bleakest thing from this movie, of just like, it doesn't really, like the truth. It's not that the truth doesn't matter, but there's this sort of like harsh reality of we're probably never going to get to the truth because of these levels of distortion. And that, and that's just utterly depressing by the end of the day.
It really is. You get the sense that, or at least I get the sense that Kurosawa is kind of using this as a what's the phrase I'm looking for? As kind of a statement, an ethos on the very art of filmmaking, how it's all artifice, and that maybe the truth, or at least in the sense that we're sort of discussing it or seeking out day in and day out, maybe that doesn't even exist. Maybe there is no real way to get to it. Of course, basic subjectivity applies, but also perhaps there is just some frivolity. Is that the right word? The frivolousness of this meaning that we're seeking out, that maybe we're just looking in the wrong place. John, am I crazy to think that maybe this is a little bit of a meta kind of statement on the very art form of cinema?
I was going to say the same thing, because I think it's spot on. The idea of what we're seeing on camera not being real, that was pretty profound in 1950. At least from what the story is about. Everyone kind of understood that what they're watching was, sure, fictional. It was something that was shot on a camera. But the idea that even within the story of the camera, what's captured is just an account, that's definitely something we hadn't seen a lot in film. There were some silent films that sort of dove into this, but I think Kurosawa does do it in a way that, like, especially with the court scene, is very heavily inspired by Passion of Joan of Arc. Yeah. But just the way that the film kind of takes an exciting story and then distills it down into being something more about, well, we're not here to entertain you, to quote that, we're here to sort of make you think and to make you ask these really difficult questions about, what if there's no truth? What if nobody is a good person? Yeah. And it outlines that, like, the only good person in this movie is a baby. And like, what are we supposed to do with that information?
Kind of this blank slate that really has no ability to have even, been tainted by the world, is the sense I get.
And we have to remember that Japan this year, in this time period when Kurosawa was making this film, he was adapting it from a short story. What was on everybody's mind in Japan at the time was the fact that two nuclear bombs had just brought this nation to a horrific tragedy like nothing anyone's ever seen in human history. The amount of people who died all at once. And so that's the backdrop for this. So you can sort of understand why Kurosawa is deciding that his takeaway from a story that on its surface seems very simple, of three people sort of trying to debate what really happened in a murder, and then adding these extra layers of like, the world is doomed, like that is really what we're dealing with here, and why the film resonates so much, because it definitely handles such serious subject matter without feeling trite, or without feeling kind of just feeling like a throwaway film that anybody could have made.
There's this sort of fatalistic tone, again, like I mentioned, that especially the priest has, where you can tell that every ounce of his faith has kind of been shaken to the core.
Can relate, honestly. Not to call myself a priest. But.
Oh, Reverend John, how about that?
No,
we're not gonna stick with that. Yeah, I was gonna say, but yeah, there is one of the things I like about this movie, and something that kind of occurred to me back in that third viewing I mentioned, is the setting of the crime, the event that we see multiple perspectives on. It takes place in the forest. And one of my favorite shots or not individual shots, but one of my favorite kind of bits in the whole movie is when the story is first being told of the woodcutter going into the forest. And it's kind of longer than you would think. It's not like he just, is in the city 1 second and walks into the forest the next. It's like at least about a minute long, I think, maybe 2 even, of just walking into the forest, deeper and deeper into the forest. You get the sense that he's kind of descending into nature, as if traversing into the very root of humanity, and how when we regress back into the wild, so to speak, kind of all of our base inclinations sort of bubble up. And that is what we end up seeing in all of the various perspectives of the story. We haven't mentioned the specific characters yet, but how have we not talked about Toshiro Mifune, his third collaboration with Akira Kurosawa after Drunken Angel and Stray Dog. Toshiro Mifune is pretty great in this, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. Kind of goes without saying.
Yeah.
I think everyone in here is really good. You'll recognize him from a lot of different things. I think not enough people give Michiko Kyo enough credit, who I think has to, in her context, the way she has to like get this character across, where she's very unlikable in every story based on these accounts, even her own. Yeah. And yet because of how dynamic her performance is, how she's so different in each story, you always feel this like aching suspicion, especially in the woodcutter story, that she's more of a victim. She is, I mean, which is objectively true. I think she's the biggest victim here, based on everything that we see. She doesn't lose her life necessarily, but she loses something that everybody's like chasing after. And I just think specifically like honor and all that. But I think her character is that actress doesn't get nearly enough credit.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And then just rounding out that sort of triangle is Masayuki Mori as the samurai, sort of this high what's the phrase, highfalutin sort of, guy, man,
goody
about society.
Two shoes, probably takes his sandals off before he goes into the house or whatever. So yeah,
and never one to act out in emotion at the drop of a hat. He's always very reserved in all of the stories, and we get to see his own testimony from beyond the grave, as I mentioned again. It is a movie, as we've mentioned in sort of various methods. It is kind of a really sad movie about the state of humanity itself, kind of the base nature of it. And I'm glad that you brought up sort of the post-war melancholy, John, because I think that is really all over this movie, and it's hard to sort of make sense of the despair in it without having that context. You know what I'm saying? Like, it might seem kind of over the top, which is not entirely untrue, but it's also coming from a very real place from that time.
And it's worth pointing out, it's kind of weird how that happens, in the sense that, so this is a Jidaeki film, so it's like a samurai period drama. And, that time period for like the samurai, that's also sort of a melancholy time. It's like, it's similar to how the West, like the American West, was waning and technology was creeping in. The cowboys were going away. That's kind of what happened in the Meiji era with the samurai, when the power of the feudal lords started to disappear and Japan started to get integrated into the rest of the world. So it's an interesting fusion of taking this time period, which usually focuses on that, right? It usually focuses on like the last samurai, like that whole thing, and to instead embrace a more harsh and cynical look of their version of a cowboy, because we see, of course, that the samurai in this is he's not so honorable. And the bandit in this is, maybe there's way more to him than he seems. Like, he wants to be the hero of the story. And so that sort of like sharp critique, I think, only exists because this was a time when the Japanese, specifically Kurosawa, wasn't trying to wax nostalgic about the Meiji period. He was trying to examine some similarities, some negative similarities, negative in the sense of, like, I guess we could just say it again, the melancholy between that period and what they're embracing in 1950.
Yeah, I want to sort of expand on what you were mentioning about the bandit, Toshiro Mifune, and it's something that has occurred to me with every single viewing, and I'm curious to hear if you two agree, is that although certainly a bad guy, he's a bandit, you know,
We
he
don't
does
like
some
him.
pretty
No.
heinous things in this movie. But at the same time, he's kind of the most I don't, honest, maybe not the right word, but kind of just the least reserved of the characters. Like he puts on the least of a facade, while he does have this kind of fake bravado. Like I love the detail where he's telling the story of the sword fight that resulted in the samurai's death, and says, "Oh yes, we crossed swords 23 times exactly.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
one's really passed 20 before, so I was very impressed." So he's got this sort of faux machismo about him, but at the same time, he's not lying about the kind of person he is, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's shameless.
Yeah, he is shameless. That's the word I was gonna say as well. But it is also, yeah, I was gonna say it's also fascinating in that he's not lying about who he is as a person, but it's also, I mean, I think just like anybody, fascinating how his story changes from the standpoint of, like you said, Sam, he's got this sort of like almost overly bravado, like to the point of being comical way of telling his side of the story, and how it slowly gets chipped away with everybody else's recount of the story. Like he's still a horrible person, but just it's kind of, if there's any sort of amusement or humor in this fairly bleak movie, it's seeing how reined back like his actions actually are based on what he said that they were.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I just want to point out, every single time he comes up, I know we'll say this, but it's worth repeating just how versatile and fantastic of an actor Toshiro Mifune is. I watched the movie Stray Dog last night because I figured, why not? It's an excuse to, which is kind of like a buddy cop detective movie from the late 40s, and you would not even know it's the same guy. Like, it's crazy how from one performance to the next, Toshiro Mifune can completely transform into a different character, and how they're all so layered, even though they appear to be kind of one note on the surface. I love all the kind of strange visual tics this specific character has. Like there's the way that he sort of scratches his face nonchalantly, like even in the middle of a battle, that still kind of goes through my mind. And I have this weird feeling that Marlon Brando was at least kind of inspired by that when playing Vito Corleone in The Godfather. And then he has these sort of jerky movements that are fun to watch, even though it is a rather reprehensible character, as we mentioned several times. So there are a few other things I want to talk about, but to go into detail. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the ending, which we alluded to briefly before. Just to give a little context, we hear the three differing accounts, and for a second, it seems like we don't really know what happened. All we know is that a man has died, and that cannot be reversed, and we don't know who to punish or how to even receive this, because these are three completely different testimonies, and we have no one to corroborate it, except, as we find out, for the woodcutter, who had sort of withheld his own evidence out of fear of not wanting to get involved, which I think brings me to this sort of interesting metaphorical reading I have of the actual events of the movie, but I'll get to that in a second. And he tells the story, and as it turns out, it was not nearly as theatrical, not nearly as melodramatic as any of the three participants had made it out to be. It was actually rather uncinematic, and I really love the way that the actual fight, as we see it, at the very least through Takashi Shimura's eyes, is a bad fight. It's just cinematically speaking, it's not very exciting. They barely, cross swords at all, and it's just rather by accident Toshiro Mifune gains the upper hand and just in the moment murders the guy, and that's kind of it. And it's this really sort of depressing revelation that that's all it really was. And then in kind of another strange revelation, they hear all of a sudden just a baby is in the temple. You know how that happens, how babies just wind up in temples. I'm sure you've experienced this, right, John?
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, to be fair, the gate is like falling apart, and
Yeah.
somebody clearly was like, well, I mean, it is important to say like this is sort of like the front entrance of a place, and like you could sort of see like somebody just be, take this baby, like somebody, it's kind of like
Yeah.
a central area. So, which by the way, do you think those pillars that start to become more skewed as the movie goes on? Do you think they're like moral pillars, Sam?
Does that happen? I did not even notice that.
Yeah, yeah. I think like after one of the stories, you notice that like the shot literally has like the pillar like sideways.
Oh wow, I did not. I'll have to pay more attention
Is
to the
is that
mise
attention
en
to
scène.
detail?
That
Goodness.
is yeah, absolutely. So that's very fascinating. I can totally see it. That seems very deliberate on the part of Kurosawa, given how many details kind of like that are in this movie. But regardless, they hear the sound of the baby crying. They're not entirely sure what to do. The commoner, who is just sort of wandering around looking for shelter, doesn't really give a second thought to what to do about the baby. Says, "Oh well, it's not our problem." Has this very pragmatic view of the world, as we see throughout the movie. The priest wants to care for the child, of course, to the point of not allowing the woodcutter to even get near the baby at first, sort of recoils. And then the woodcutter says, "No, I've got 6 kids of my own. One more isn't going to make any difference." And you can tell he has sort of this moment of having gone through something traumatic, something strange, something kind of existentially depressing, and just decides, you know what, this is what I can do. Like this is the way that I can contribute to the world. There's a lot that I don't have control over, but this one thing I can do, this one good thing I can put out into the world, and takes the baby and presumably raises it to be of a fine, fulfilling human being. Now, I just sort of gave a little bit of my own reading. Ryan, I'm curious, do you have any particular reading of this final scene, kind of maybe the implications of it or anything?
Honestly, I don't, beyond really what's on the surface. Admittedly, this is only my second time watching the movie after that aforementioned first time at the top. But no, I mean, I don't have any other reading other than just the baby essentially being that redemption, that like one, like, okay, I this is my good deed for, trading in for everything else. So that's, I mean, I don't really have any much a deeper reading than that.
Okay, fair enough. John, what about yourself? What do you think the secret is?
I'm always about the theories. My weird theory with this has always been...
You think the baby is the reincarnated samurai?
No, I have heard that theory before. That's a fun theory.
Oh, that's a weird one.
Yeah, I've heard the theory that the baby was in the story, and I've kind of had the feeling that like the baby was there the whole time, and the baby belonged to the wife and the husband, and she didn't want to care for it afterward and abandoned the baby after everything that happened. I get it. It's flimsy, but
yeah, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that Kurosawa would write in to this story.
Well, you never know, just because like the idea of the child being there the whole time, and then no one, everyone's just trying to like get out of this situation. That's kind of where my suspicion of that comes from. But even beyond all that, picking around of certain things. Yeah, I think that the ending, we were dancing around it, obviously. I mean, it's sort of looking at this tragic situation. And at this point, the movie has raised all of these questions about why even exist? Why even go on? And what Kurosawa seems to be saying here is that, like, look, there's nothing you can really do about the past. Real justice can't really exist. Like, what happened in Hiroshima was terrible, a disaster. But the only thing we can do now is we can move on and invest in the next generation. We can do our good deeds, like Ryan says. And as soon as the woodcutter sort of accepts that, yeah, sure, maybe there's no such thing as a good person. Maybe we're all motivated by self-interest, like the commoner sort of questions. But then the idea is that even feeling that guilt that he does tells you that life is worth living. And our lives can be worth living if we decide that another life is worth living. And I think it's a great way to jump off of the last story, which is all about the tragic effects of violence. That violence isn't flashy like it is in the movies, to get back to Kurosawa criticizing how movies can glorify war and violence without really challenging the implications of these events. Even in movies like Seven Samurai, which are exciting movies about violence, at the end of that movie, to give it away, I think people kind of understand what happens at the end of that movie at this point.
Yeah.
It's a tragic note it ends on.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the people who've died, who've had to give their lives. They've done it selflessly. They've done it to protect, and they've done it in a righteous fashion. But it's something to take seriously and not make light of death. It's what bothers me so much about like remakes and things. When we get like that Magnificent Seven remake, one of the things that bugged me the most about that was how it learns all the wrong lessons that I think Kurosawa was trying to tell through these movies, which is, it's not about how cool a sword fight is or that Chris Pratt can flip his guns in the air. It's, it's about how when people die, it means something. You lose something when somebody dies. And so, that's my little rant. The only one that's gotten it right is A Bug's Life. I felt that movie. I knew.
I'm very fortunate to have avoided that Magnificent Seven remake, and I'll probably continue to do so.
It's not terrible, but it's just inescapable to be like, wow, this is preschool, compared to,
I do know, John. I do know. Yeah, I remember almost nothing about that remake, so I suppose that's for the better. And I want to sort of piggyback on that a little bit. And the way I kind of look at this movie is not as like some, Seventh Seal-esque metaphor, but kind of just a symbolic interaction between different outlooks on humanity. You have the priest, who is, in theory at least, kind of the hopeful side of it, kind of trying to see the light in everything, believe that everyone is inherently good. And then you have the commoner, who has this, like I said, just this pragmatic stance on everything. There's no nonsense, there's nothing we can really do, so why even bother attitude. And then we have the woodcutter, who, as near as we can tell before the events of the story, was somewhat, I don't want to say apathetic, but just didn't have any particular leaning one way or the other. You get the sense that he kind of just, does what he needs to do every day to get by. I might be reading into it slightly, but that's just the sense I get. And then when confronted with this experience, with this story, unlike anything he's ever heard before, kind of has to learn from it. Like, it doesn't have a choice, because it's not like he's going to forget. This is going to sort of affect the rest of his life, we assume. And I love the way how at the end, when he decides to care for that child, you get the sense that he's kind of deciding to take in both worldviews, to say, yes, like John said, again, not everyone is perfect. No one can be. Not everyone is good even. But there are things we can do that will make the world a better place, even if it's just in a small way, and even if it does not cure all the bad within it. And I think it's tremendously inspiring. And you definitely get the sense that Kurosawa is siding more with the commoner, with sort of the pessimistic view of humanity. If you know anything about, sort of Kurosawa's personal beliefs, then I think that definitely rings true. Not that he's some horribly depressed person or anything, but just sort of has no illusions about the state of humanity. And I think this is coming to a really beautiful conclusion that is kind of, it's weird that this isn't Kurosawa's best movie. You know what I'm saying? Like, a movie this good, the fact that it's not the filmmaker's best is still is strange to me.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that.
Where do you think this ranks, John? Where like is it's upper echelon for sure? I think we can agree.
It's
But do you have
close, super close. It's either number 2 or 3, I think.
yeah.
And I think the only reason it's not number 1 is because I don't think that the ending is satisfying enough for everyone. And there
really?
is something that does sort of feel like, yeah, I think that even in his other films that end on a bleak note, or even a note that is superficially redemptive, there it still feels like you're at the end of something really important. Whereas this movie, it kind of pokes and prods you to think about those important things. But it's one of those movies where like the most enjoyment you get out of it is after you watch it, compared to his other films that are just, coming back to Seven Samurai again. I think that you just can fully appreciate that film from start to finish at a level that you can't really do with this film. It's not to, drag it down at all. It's not a flaw. Sure. It's just the reality of the kind of movie it is.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. I don't fault it for that in the same way. I think that's just what makes it unique, is that it's sort of is
not trying to fault
taken
it.
In. Of course. It's just meant to be consumed differently, I think. Ryan, where do you think this ranks roughly amongst Kurosawa's filmography?
For me personally, probably fourth. Which is certainly no knock by any stretch of the word, but I mean, I think I'd have to go probably Seven Samurai first. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but I mean, there's really not much else, to say. It's such an achievement. Number 2 for me would probably be Yojimbo, for just the sheer entertainment value of that one. Probably his most purely entertaining movie, arguably. And then I'd probably go Akira for me, and then Rashomon.
Very good. Yeah, it's almost impossible to go wrong with anything by Kurosawa, really. I've yet to see anything worse than like a vaguely watchable story, and I've seen a good deal of them. I think this is a solid number 2. And again, if it were literally any other filmmaker, it would be number 1, because this is remarkable. I made a list a few months ago of like my favorite movies of all time, and Rashomon was in the top 15. So that's nothing to sneeze at. Seven Samurai was number 2. Hard to compete with that. Kind of like one of the perfect movies, but this is remarkable. And I think we've talked a lot about it. I think we've really established how it's a movie that really evolves, not just in its own context, but as it gets watched repeatedly by someone. So I think it's definitely one that should not just be a one and done. I think it warrants multiple viewings. So on that note, I'm going to say, why don't we give some final thoughts? Anything else we want to mention? Anything else we want to bring up? And then we'll do our recommendations for this one, which I'm very curious to hear about. John, why don't you take point on this?
Sure. I've been chomping at the bit to talk about one of my favorite things about this movie, which I can sort of contextualize a little bit more of like why it's so high up for me, because like Ryan, I have a real soft spot for Akira. And then I also, sometimes it just depends on the most recent Kurosawa film I've seen, like Hidden Fortress, Throne of Blood. I mean, it really just depends like what gets up there. But I think something that Rashomon does that does make it stand out a little bit is how just like the filmmaking and the cinematography, it just feels so unleashed here. Like there's just something about it that the look of everything is so like beautifully messy.
Yeah.
Just in the sense that like, I don't know, I feel like the story is so much more intentionally enhanced by the settings. We already talked about how there's 3 settings and everything. And it's pretty easy to jump on like the idea that, the rain sort of represents the sadness. Okay, we all get that. But then also, there's some subtler things there of like how like the sun peeking through the leaves, and when they're in like the judicial area, how the sun, like it seems like the light is like all over them, and like truth is like shining down. And, you always just sort of feel like these colors are at war with each other. And this is a film that could only be told the story in black and white, because as we've mentioned, there's the obvious like morality feeling that evokes, but even just the idea that we all process color in a different way, and we all sort of perceive things, even things that we're watching right next to people, we can disagree over what we just saw. And that is a profound and depressing thing that, especially in our modern world where there are such things as deep fakes, that we're in a society where two people will look at something that just happened in the news and come away with it with completely different interpretations. They're looking at the same thing, but because of a set of circumstances beyond everyone's control, we feel like everybody else is just ridiculous for not seeing things our way. So this is such a beautiful film and capturing that through just the very simple limitation of how color works. It's such a basic elemental thing. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, I just loved it, the little cinematography tweaks in here. Like, every time I read about this movie, reading about how they use like mirrors to amplify the natural light, and I just love it when they do certain things. Like, nothing is taken for granted. Nothing is shot just because we have a day to shoot it. Like, this movie had a huge budget, relatively, and it didn't make a lot of money, but you feel like, you feel that they put the time and effort with the money that they did have to make this thing just feel authentic to the vision and feel like something like nobody else had ever seen. There's a reason that it's the Rashomon effect and not anything else, that I can't even off the top of my head think of other films that have dove into this territory, because Rashomon just did it so well that it is now just the standard bearer. So yeah. And last thing I'll say is it's weird because watching it too, the way that this movie sort of feels so well staged, it made me think, and you guys are going to think I'm ridiculous, this is not one of my recommendations, but it made me think of the way Jon Favreau makes movies, which is probably very controversial, but okay.
I'm just trying to make sense of it. That's a strange thing.
Jon Favreau, three things in particular that he's made. Okay. I'm not talking about Elf or Iron Man, but
sure,
Jungle Book and the Lion King remake and Mandalorian. I think, despite the Lion King remake being the epitome of everything that I think is wrong with modern blockbusters, one thing that you can, putting it lightly, I think the thing you can hold to that film is its ability to take artificial filmmaking and create something just wildly immersive, seemingly out of nothing, basically out of nothing, out of just things out of a computer. I did kind of think of how Favreau just has such a knack for that sort of thing. And I think the connection to Star Wars made him a perfect fit to work with Filoni and everyone with Mandalorian, because I think that is such a great representation of the same sort of thing. Star Wars obviously has been deeply connected and inspired by Kurosawa for a long time. So just want to point that out, that like people who may not know what's my way into this, anything Star Wars for sure, but anything sort of like teetering on that idea of like a soundstage that you never would have guessed in a million years is a soundstage.
That's very interesting. I never would have thought that in a million years. So this is why we have John Negroni on the show. I want to see that clickbait article. How
Favreau's the next Kurosawa, says disgraced film critic.
Disgraced. Soon to be disgraced film critic. Oh my goodness. That is fantastic. Yeah, we didn't mention this, but I just want to briefly say that there is definitely a very, very down low aesthetic to this whole thing. The actual entire cast and crew lived together during the production of this movie. So you can tell that there was not a moment wasted when it came to artistic collaboration, and they really knew what they needed to tell the story, kind of the bare minimum, and yet it was more than enough at the same time. Ryan, did you have any final thoughts on the Mandalorian? I'm such
it's working.
I'm such a dyslexic, mentally dyslexic fool. On Rashomon.
I mean, I don't think I could top the comparisons to Jon Favreau, so I maybe should keep it at bay. But
wait a second, it's because he's also John. I just realized.
They got the John thing going
now
on.
You get what Rashomon was really referring to.
Oh man, okay, but but for real, to piggyback off one thing John said, because he mentioned something that basically was going to be my closing argument of just from the standpoint or argument. We're not on trial like the characters in this movie, but closing remarks is that it's like John said, like the storytelling device, there's a reason it's called the Rashomon effect. I mean, like you can think of I mean, I can't think of another movie to where a whole storytelling device is named after that. I mean, there might be certain like techniques or shots. I mean, like dolly zoom is either the vertigo shot or the Jaws shot, like whatever.
Yeah.
But I can't for the life of me think of another movie that is named, like a technique is named after. And it's no small feat. So no, that's really just my closing thought of just like, you know, this movie's so important to the fabric of cinema that it's really like a movie that, you know, not to shame anybody if they haven't seen it, but like probably you should, you know, you should include this in your cinematic diet if you haven't watched it.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that 100%. This is a must see for anyone even remotely interested in the art form of cinema or otherwise, because it's great. And that's kind of all there is to it. I do
have one possible to what you're saying. I think you could make an argument that Citizen Kane, like people sort of have taken like the Citizen Kane as a name to sort of like, it's almost more though of a criticism thing of people using Citizen Kane as a benchmark. That's the closest thing I could think of.
Oh, sure. That makes sense. But
it's more of a colloquialism than an actual technique, but I see what you're saying.
You're more of a colloquialism than a technique.
Always have been, John, and I'm ashamed that you've thought any differently. I don't know why we're going into this caricature, but regardless. Yeah, I second everything that both of you said. This is a really remarkable movie in the way that it sort of bends the actual art form of cinema kind of right under your nose. Like it's not even showy about it or anything. And yet it uses it to its kind of its fullest extent. And the net result is really one of the most thoughtful, most rewatchable, most easy to sink your teeth into movies ever. And it's one of my favorites of all time. And I just want to give a quick shout out to, I hope I pronounce this right, Fumio Hayasaka, the composer. The soundtrack to this movie does not get nearly enough credit. And I really
better than Beethoven?
Yes, better than Beethoven, John, as Ludwig John Beethoven. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so with that, let us give our recommendations. Now, John, you teased us before recording this, so we might as well start. What is your recommendation to go along with Rashomon?
Oh, well, clearly it's Elf. No.
I knew it.
Okay.
Clearly it's Zathura, right?
So I don't know if you know this, Sam, but I absolutely love samurai folklore. I know we've talked about it a lot. I think with Seven Samurai, I think my recommendation with that was Silence, because that was a movie that just really knocked my socks off when it came to telling a new kind of story about Japanese culture in this era. But yeah, I'm a sucker for this sort of thing. And one of the reasons, the first thing in my life as a kid that really brought me into the romanticism of the samurai genre, it wasn't a black and white samurai movie. Funny enough, that came later in life. It was a little show called Rurouni Kenshin. Now, I don't know if either of you have ever heard of Rurouni Kenshin or watched a single episode of it, but it was a series that came out in the 1990s. It was based on a manga at the time by somebody who actually by today is kind of a terrible person, unfortunately, based on just some things he's been arrested for. But regardless, it was the story of like a wandering samurai. I learned so much about this time period, the time period of when it became illegal to have a sword out in public, like that sort of thing. So it was a very foundational show for me. While kids were watching the Dragon Ball Z and such,
the Dragon Ball Z,
your boy was getting into the Rurouni Kenshin. And years
Negroni
after
Kenshin. Yeah.
Negroni Kenshin. But years after the show had sort of concluded, there was an OVA, an original video animation that covered the backstory of this anime. It was called Samurai X. It has a bunch of different names. Sometimes it's referred to as Rurouni Kenshin, Trust and Betrayal. But it is I think it's feature length, because it's like several episodes stitched into one. So it's like a movie length sort of thing. And it came out, I want to say in 2003. And it is a beautiful, absolutely awe-striking film. The animation in it is top notch. Some of the best action, choreography. But then the thing that sort of brings it into the same world as something like Rashomon is its story, which is about an assassin who is sort of trying to help the government rein in these people defending the shogun while they're trying to bring on democracy. And you sort of get a feeling for this like freedom fighter samurai who becomes known as the Batosai, the manslayer, because he's able to kill so many people. And the show itself takes place years after this, when he has decided that he's never going to kill again. So kind of like the Batman thing in a way. And the thing though about this OVA that reminds me of Rashomon is how nature does tell the story in this. Like the beautiful stillness of this, the moments where we're seeing a huge chunk of this is this assassin, because of a certain mission he's on, having to pretend at a domesticated life with a woman who he has murdered her husband, and she's aware of it. And they have to pretend to be husband and wife, and how over time this like force of like this forcing upon him of peace begins to change how he feels about violence and war. And that relationship of it is clearly heavily inspired by, I think, the undercurrent of Rashomon. So I think anybody checking this out will be in for quite a treat, especially if you like animation for your samurai. I know I do. And that again, it's called Rurouni Kenshin Trust and Betrayal, or Samurai X Trust and Betrayal. 100% recommend.
Very nice. I'm writing that down right now.
Same
that
here.
Sounds fascinating. Cool. And Ryan, what about yourself? What did you want to recommend?
Sure, I have two. One of them I already mentioned, and it's Akira, and I'm not just copping out because it's also directed by Kurosawa, and it has a great Takashi Shimura performance. Excuse me, but I feel like, as far as at least the movies in his filmography that I've seen, especially the final third of Akira is probably the most. It's so good, it's so heartbreaking, but like I feel the closest to Rashomon in the sense of like how people perceive things, how memory is distorted. I think that it just fits along with this movie perfectly. And even though it's, widely beloved, I still don't even feel it's quite talked about in the same circles as like Seven Samurai, for example. So I'd recommend Akira. And then at the top of the episode, I mentioned that I had read a review back in college that said the movie had a Rashomon-like tone, a movie that actually just passed a small milestone itself, just celebrated its 10th anniversary, and that is The Social Network, David Fincher's The Social Network. And that movie, it's pretty linear from the story that we're seeing, but just because, you're seeing the various perspectives in the courtroom scenes between Zuckerberg, between Eduardo, between the Winklevoss twins, it has a very similar, like, getting to the bottom of this, who is right, who's in the right, each one of their stories making them look better out of it. So I think that, it's not a samurai picture by any means, but it has, it's one of the, kind of prime contemporary examples of the Rashomon structure. So, most people have seen it, but I will still always recommend it because I think it's great.
Yeah, and it's interesting to recommend movies in specific context too, even if they're well known. Sort of pairing them with something else can make it more interesting. So that had not even crossed my mind, but I've been meaning to rewatch The Social Network. So maybe this will be what it takes to push me over the edge.
Just for the soundtrack alone, I would recommend. Doing that.
There you go. Another great soundtrack. Something else they have in common. I only have one recommendation, and it is a little bit of an obvious one, but it also isn't, because like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, did you know that Rashomon also had an American remake in the 1960s? This is not a rhetorical question.
I did not know this.
The Western version of it?
The Western version. It's called The Outrage.
Oh, I've heard of that. With Paul Newman's in that, isn't he?
Paul Newman plays the Toshiro Mifune character. And then here, listen to this supporting cast. It's Paul Newman, Lawrence Harvey, Claire Bloom, Edward G. Robinson, and William Shatner.
Wow.
Wow.
This thing has a hell of a cast. And I talked about it years ago on the very first episode of Anyway, That's All I Got, which is now defunct as of...
Oh, maybe that's what I heard it. Okay. Because I knew I've heard of this.
I'm the only one I know who even knows about it besides the people I've told about it for that episode. And I was able to track it down years ago and I watched it. We talked about it on our best remakes episode, and it's actually quite good. Like, it's, if you go in knowing that it's just not going to reach the level of Kurosawa, it's a very competent remake. Like, it retells the story very effectively. It is not, it doesn't diverge from it in any meaningful way. It's just the same thing, but a different time and a different place. And it's effective. Again, it does not reach into the soul in quite the same way, and it does not have quite the same visual aesthetic. So it was never going to be as good, and obviously it isn't. But if you're curious to see maybe a version in the English language and maybe a little bit more of a recognizable time period, if you're unfamiliar with films like Rashomon, then this is a damn good place to start. It's one of the better remakes I've ever seen, just in terms of doing it again, sort of telling it in a different language, but the same story, you know?
I'll have to mark that down. I mean, I guess it makes sense. So many of Kurosawa's movies have had an English language analog of some kind, so that would make sense.
Yeah, he's a very influential filmmaker on both the East and the West art landscapes, and so for that,
Sam,
that reason and many more.
I do remember when you were describing this, I didn't picture the actors for some reason. I just remember picturing Woody's Roundup as the characters with, of course, Sheriff Woody as the notorious bandit. I think Jesse was the wife.
Oh my
and
God.
For some reason, so Prospector Pete was like the woodcutter character, and I think Buzz Lightyear was the one guy who was tied up. My mind went there.
And then Bullseye was the horse. Because naturally.
I mean,
that's so strange.
He is a horse.
You eat, sleep, and breathe Pixar, John. This is the most on-brand revelation.
I've only mentioned Pixar twice, Sam, in an hour and 12 minutes. Come on.
Yeah, that's hardly anything in the grand scheme of things. Oh my goodness, you're a very admirable man, John.
What's the next film we're talking about? Is it Toy Story 1, 2, 3?
It is all three of them, and so we're going to talk about all four. I love how you didn't mention 4 either, but no, it's actually
too soon.
It's a little too soon, yeah. No, so that is it for Rashomon. See it if you hadn't. I think that's if there's any takeaway, and even if you have, watch it again. It's worth it. I promise. We're going to take a huge pivot of kind of an unprecedented degree, even on Extra Milestone. And you should have seen the triple feature we had last week. We're going to jump forward 25 years to 1975. We're going to talk about the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey. 2 young, ordinary, healthy kids.
Oh, Brad, wasn't it wonderful?
Left Denton that late November evening.
We must have taken the wrong fork a few miles back. Didn't we pass a castle back down the road a few miles? Maybe they have a telephone I could use.
On a night out.
Hello.
It was a night out they were going to remember for a very long time.
I remember doing the Time Warp,
which is a movie that John doesn't care for. So if you don't hear his voice for a long time, that's probably why. Is that true, John?
I want to be nice. You know, I don't want to.
Okay. Good luck.
I don't want to be that guy who's like, because I have nothing against this movie and the people who love it. I get it. But I do have some things to say to explain why I do not care for this film.
Okay. I'm very curious to hear them. And you know what? You're in doing sort of a little bit of a rudimentary letterbox research for this. You're actually not as alone as you might think. There are a lot of people who just can't get into it for whatever reason. They're just they all seem to see the appeal, but at the same time are not latching onto it. So I'm curious to hear how your experience defines it. Now, Ryan Oliver, on the other hand, I understand that you're a very big fan of this.
Yes, I love this movie. It's absolutely one of my favorite movies. You know, I don't think it's like the greatest movie ever made or anything like that, but yeah, I love this movie wholeheartedly.
Interesting. Well, we might as well hear how did this start? When did you first discover Rocky Horror?
Sure thing. So I first saw it in high school, and believe it or not, you know, I guess it's a whole thing. I actually didn't care for it the first time I saw it. One thing I did want to bring up specifically with the story, because I think Sam, you and I talked a little bit off mic about this, and you know, you mentioned that you watching this was not like the ideal setting, i.e. not at a midnight show for the movie. Yeah. I actually think for the first viewing, you were in the perfect setting, because my first viewing was a midnight show of the movie, which I've gone to many since and have enjoyed. But I think all of us here, I mean, as cinemaholics, as film lovers, when you're trying to actually watch the movie and grasp the context and the dialogue, and you have people shouting lines at the screen and throwing pieces of bread and rice at the screen, like it's a little frustrating when you don't know what's happening. Yeah, rice is, you throw rice during not Brad and Janet's wedding, whatever wedding Brad and Janet go to.
Weird.
Before Damn It Janet. Yeah, you throw rice at that, and I can't remember when the bread comes in, but it's been a minute.
Somewhere.
It's got to be somewhere in there. But so that was my first viewing, and I was like actively frustrated because I was trying to watch the movie, and you know, I still had a good time because I was out with my friends. We were out, you know, we went to the midnight show at the Clinton Street Theater in Portland, Oregon, which has pretty much played it every Saturday at midnight since 1976 when it was revived. One of the most ideal places to see it. So it was fun, but like it was definitely a weird experience. You know, cut to, I think maybe a year later, 2 years later, my family, like when I was high school, I think even in college, even after I moved away, would do poker nights, like with just like my immediate family and some extended family. And I think I got knocked out and was just flipping through the channels, and Rocky Horror Picture Show was on. So I was like, oh, you know, I've only seen it that one time and I'd like to actually watch the movie. So I sat down and watched it beginning to end. And yeah, that's when I fell in love with it, and then ultimately went to more midnight shows and made them much more enjoyable. But no, I love it. I mean, we'll get into it, but I mean, I think for me, it's just the, you know, I love, you know, out there cinema and B movie cinema. And, you know, given that this movie is just, you know, it's super palatable, but just given that it's such a love letter to those types of movies. And then also just straight up, every song is a banger. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I don't think there's a single bad song in this movie. I mean, my hot take even is like Time Warp is maybe like 4th or 5th at best. Like, to me, like that's how good I think the music is in this movie. And as far as like, you know, introductory like performances, you know, performances that you know, introduce the world to a certain actor. I mean, Tim Curry in this movie, man, I cannot. There are other, you know, great like sort of debut performances, but to me, this is an all timer. I just like when he walks on screen, you're just like, yeah, he's running away with the entire movie and does pretty much that. Like, but yeah, we'll get more into it, but yeah, I adore this movie.
I love how, and I picked up on this very quickly. As soon as Tim Curry shows up in this movie as the fantastic Dr. Frank Enfurter, everyone yields to Tim Curry. Like, everyone kind of, like, no one has any illusions about who the star of this scene is. You know what I'm saying? How no one tries to outperform Tim Curry, and they are right to do so, and it makes the entire ensemble better for it. And I want to address what you were mentioning about sort of viewing settings with this movie, because it's kind of one of the things that's most famous for is the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of midnight screenings that have taken place over the span of 45 years. And I'm so vindicated to hear you say how unideal that first experience is, because and I'm going to throw my own father under the bus here, but for as long as I can remember, my dad has told me that like the first time you see Rocky Horror, it has to be in a theater. And I just keep trying to explain, no, Dad, you don't understand. This is I have to focus on movies in a certain way. Like I'm obnoxious about it. Whenever someone talks, I kind of hiss at them. And so just the thought of that being the first experience with something, although I imagine it would be fun, it still does not sound ideal to me. And so this was my first viewing of it, which is so strange given how iconic it is. But I just watched it yesterday and was immediately taken by just how utterly joyous it is at every turn, and how even though it's like this kind of mysterious sci-fi, almost horror movie in some ways, it never gets too serious, and not in any kind of bad way. It totally knows the kind of campy tone it's trying to strike, and it does it from minute one and carries it through all the way to the end, and to the point where now I want the world to resume somewhat more than ever, because I want to experience this thing in the theater setting as soon as possible. There is a theater actually near me in Denver, the Esquire Theater, world famous theater, that plays, when theaters are open at least, that plays Rocky Horror regularly, like at least once a month. It's a thing that they do. They do the same thing with The Room, and Tommy Wiseau actually visits the theater all the time.
They do that at not the Clinton in Portland, but they do that in Cinema 21 in Portland quite a bit with The Room. But that's probably a different Extra Milestone discussion if it ever makes it on an Extra Milestone. But I highly do
2023. Here we come.
But I do highly recommend getting to do that experience once you can, because there really is nothing like it. And I wanted to piggyback off you said about how that this movie knows the tone that it's going for, and that's not easy. Like you see any sort of like contemporaries that go for that sort of like that level of both being sincere but also kind of winking, and it's like really not an easy tone to pull off. I think, like, for me, I mean, there's another contemporary for various different reasons I'm going to recommend towards the end, but like the one that comes to mind is a total stinker, and apologies to people who like it because I know they do, is like Repo the Genetic Opera, the one that like one of the Saw directors did. It's terrible, but like it tries so hard to like ride that Rocky Horror line, and it's like you watch it, this movie makes it seem so effortless, but like it's a really hard thing to pull off. And I think that it's, that's something to really credit the movie is not only does it know what it is, but it actually pulls it off too.
Yeah. I think that is kind of the dictionary definition of camp, which is a word that kind of gets used a lot, but I'm not sure that it always gets used correctly. It is.
Yeah. Where are the tents? Where are the counselors?
This isn't Friday the 13th. We didn't.
One thing you chime in to say is a joke about the word camp, John. That is
sorry. Something in this movie has to be funny.
Oh, I see how it is. I see how it is. I want to ask about your view in a second, but first I just want to sort of establish what kind of the difference between camp and other similar things. It's not just when something's like really crazy and zany and stuff, which is always fun. Camp has a certain level of sincerity to it. There's a certain degree of not acknowledging that it's weird, of not winking at the camera. I think specifically of not the Adam West Batman TV series as a whole, but Adam West in that specifically. He's the kind of the only straight person in that entire show, meaning that he's in on the joke, but will never acknowledge it in character. And it results in being able to laugh at, or with a movie, I should say, with a movie or TV show for its kind of, how should I say this, for kind of making itself try to appear as though it's high art when actually we know that it knows it's not. I have no idea if any of that makes sense, but
I think
yeah.
we touched on that a little bit when we were talking about Ed Wood last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes what people don't get about it, camp itself, you have to try to do it. Like it's an actual like legit filmmaking style.
Yes.
You know, it's not something that a film just accidentally is. Like maybe accidentally, like they didn't intend for it to be camp, possibly. But at the same time, like there is something about how camp it's a style that they're trying to undermine the idea that all art or high art or whatever you want to call it has to be good, you know, or that something, I should switch that around, that something has to be high art in order for it to be good. The idea of camp is that it can be good because it's enjoyable, because it's bad ironically. You know, something like The Room, you can enjoy that, even though it's camp in the sense that it's, you know, doesn't have those lofty ambitions, depending on how you interpret Wisso's, you know, intentions for that movie.
It's incredibly sincere, which I think only adds to the campness of it.
Well, and I think that's the thing too, is like camp, whether it's achieved intentionally or unintentionally, has to come across as sincere. And I think that's what's hard to pull off about it. You know, it really is, you know, it's like John said, it is a filmmaking style. And, you know, there's a film, it's like, I don't want to fast forward to recommendations, but like one of my recommendations is going to touch on that, where it's like, I think blank movie is intentionally campy and was completely like misread at the time. Like, and it's, and people just kind of, you know, some camp can go either way. People are like, oh, it's campy, I enjoy it, or like, oh, that's trash, it's camp. But like, it's just a hard thing to achieve. It's just a hard thing to achieve. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but it's just, it's okay. It's hard to pull off.
Do you want to jump ahead a little bit? The recommendation you were just talking about. Why don't you go ahead and give it right now?
Sure. Okay. Cause I got two others on top of it. Okay. Paul Verhoeven's Showgirls is one that like comes to mind.
Dang it. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to spoil anything, but like, that's one that comes to my mind where it's like,
don't spoil Showgirls.
Dude, look, I love
crazy
that movie.
Stuff happen in it.
Well, I mean, honestly, they've probably been memed to death at this point. Like you in the ether is probably the bullet points, but like that movie to me, like it's camp. Yes. And it was so dismissed at the time as being campy and trashy and terrible. But it's like you watch the movie, especially, you know, given how sort of like reappraised a lot of Paul Verhoeven's work has been in the last, you know, decade or so. You watch Showgirls and you're like, oh yeah, this fits perfectly in his filmography. He knows exactly what he was doing. And I don't know what the hell everyone is freaking out about. Like, this is exactly the movie he set out to make. It is exactly the, like, you know, showbiz satire that he was intending. And you know, I think it 100% pulls off exactly what it's supposed to do, but people were overly dismissive of it. And truthfully, I mean, even though Rocky Horror is a titan now in, you know, the realm of that type of movie, it had the same fate in 1975. I mean, notoriously, this movie was not received well. It was a huge bomb. It did not do well at all. And it wasn't until the revival screenings that the movie really took off. And so, you know, camp has this tendency to be misunderstood. And usually the ones that hit that mark do eventually come back around. Yeah.
I think that's true. I found out something during doing a little bit of research into this movie that I actually didn't know before, and it's fascinating. And it's weird to me that this sort of little bit of trivia isn't talked about more. But because of some sort of technicality in the release, just details of this movie, it technically is still in limited release for 45 years straight. So It makes it the longest running release in cinema history by far. And it is just constantly raking in the dough and everything. So I was fascinated to find that out. And
which, not to shout over you, but that's also why, I mean, it's kind of changed now given our current state of the world
Yeah,
and
I was
the
curious about
cinematic
that.
landscape. Yeah, but it like even there was a big piece. I want to say, I don't know if it was a piece or if it's just something I saw on Twitter, but like Matt Solar Sites did some really good like research into when Disney bought Fox, they were slowly not like licensing their titles out for repertory showings. Like if you wanted to book Alien, you couldn't do it. They were just slowly, you know, putting them in their proverbial vault. The only movie that they would still license out to cinemas was the Rocky Horror Picture Show because of that technicality, because it was the only one that was still actually bringing in money consistently. And truthfully would hurt a ton of theaters if they just decided, nope, we're not going to show Rocky Horror Picture Show anymore.
Oh gosh, yeah.
You know,
There was a huge uproar.
Yeah, there was a huge uproar about it. And so it's like it would certain theaters would die because their biggest ticket for the weekend is a midnight showing of Rocky Horror on Saturday. Like I said, that's changed a little bit given that the primary movies playing in drive-ins and whatever theaters are open is repertory cinema. So Disney's opened those purse strings a little bit more. But like for a minute there, I think that was the only movie that they would still license out for repertory showings.
It shows that maybe Disney as a corporation does have one human bone in its enormous Cthulhu carcass or whatever it's called.
It's like that line in God, I thought of it this week. I forgot what it was in regards to, and it's such a forgotten movie. I don't know why it popped in my head, but it reminds me of that line in the Starsky and Hutch remake that Todd Phillips did, where Snoop Dogg's Huggy Bear sees the Gran Torino, and he's like, "Damn, Starsky, that puts you at up a notch in my book. That puts you at notch 1." And that's sort of Disney with their licensing of Fox titles. It's like, okay, you're at notch 1. Good for you.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for Rocky Horror to be at Epcot.
Oh, only a matter of time. Yeah, I would not, if they had decided to pull it completely, I would not have been surprised at all, but I'm glad they didn't. And I hope that this tradition will continue once theaters can resume operations, hopefully sooner rather than later. Now, John Negroni.
Yeah,
host of Cinemaholics. We've heard a little bit from you, but you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you're not a fan of this movie, and I want to get into that a little bit because this is sort of a different side of the conversation that, as I mentioned, I did get a little bit of a glimpse of in doing the research. So tell us about it.
I feel like I'm in court. I feel like we're back in Rashomon.
Yes, you are.
It's like, all right, here's what happened.
The Passion of John of Arc.
I watched this movie.
That was good.
I see how it is.
That was fantastic.
Trying to reference one of my favorite movies of all time and then just switching names around. And you think that I'm just going to slap you on the back or something. Yeah, Rocky Horror Picture Show. First time I watched this movie, I was 19 and unexpected way of watching it, I'll put it that way, was so I had started dating this girl and her parents,
the plot thickens.
Her parents are huge fans of this movie. And
oh my gosh, you told me about this before. I think I just remembered. Yeah.
Notably her father. And so the thing you need to know about this guy was he was an ass. Nobody liked him. He was just a very difficult person to get along with, just extremely sarcastic and like just not fun to talk to. You're just very annoying human being. And I, at this point we had been dating for a while, so I kind of got to know them a bit, but I did not expect this because this is a very conservative family. Okay. Like hardcore conservative Republican. Right. And so one day we're hanging out at the house and they're like, well, John, you work at a movie theater. Have you guys ever played a Rocky Horror Picture Show? Because I was in high school or college at the time, so I was still working at the theater. And I was like, yeah, we've had showings and stuff, but like I've never actually seen it. It doesn't, I had heard of it, but it didn't really look like my kind of thing. I just wasn't into like 70s movies, as you know, Sam. Like if it came out in the 1970s, there was a bit of a gap for me, and I just, I just never really had a particular interest, even though I liked musicals plenty and horror films. But yeah, unless it was something like a John Carpenter movie or, The Godfather. Yeah, I just wasn't big on those films at the time.
Okay.
However, this man decided, all right, well, here's what the three of us are going to do. Me, my girlfriend at the time, and him. Watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh my. And
the uncomfortable nature of this scenario, I didn't
even
know
at
what
19
to
years
do.
old.
Well, because like there was a little bit of an air of, is this guy possibly, there was something about him where I always kind of suspected there might be a little bit of like, he might be slightly bicurious, but he can't admit it. And I hate to say that or speculate about someone, but because I dislike him as a person, I will just say that there was a lot of repression I could sense in this guy. And so some of that definitely rose to the top of my mind when we were watching this movie, because it really animated him in a way that I thought was kind of bizarre. Now, I will say, I watched it, and the first time I watched it, I thought, that's kind of fun. I like the songs. I had heard some of them before from like an episode of Glee or something. I think that was around the time. In fact, that might have inspired why we were talking about it in the first place, because Glee had done like an episode about Rocky Horror Picture Show. All right. And so I watched it and I was like, yes, it's weird, but I kind of appreciated it. I still do. I think that it's one of those movies that like, it really just empowers this like countercultural attitude and this sort of like just ability to like laugh at the establishment, to laugh at like being straight laced and not take things too seriously, have a laugh, have a good time. I agree that the songs are good. I like Time Warp like everybody else. And the one I always really liked was Touch It, Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me.
Yes.
That one's pretty, I like that whole scene. My thing with this movie is it wears out its welcome for me. The second time I saw it, I've never seen it at live screenings, or maybe that's what would bring it out of me, but I was just bored to death. I just couldn't. I was just like, all right. Like, I get it. Tim Curry's really cool in this. I think that his performance is just, it's one of a kind. It's one in a million, but I don't know. It had diminishing returns for me. I just didn't feel it. I was just kind of like, this feels super indulgent to me, and just the pointlessness of it caught up to me by the second viewing. And I've never had an appetite to revisit it since. And I think all of the mania around it sometimes comes across to me as sort of like, it's a big deal because it's a big deal. Like, I don't know. I don't always get the sense that people really like this. Not to say that about either of you two, but like, I don't know. I've talked to people who like, it's like their personality to like this movie, which kind of weirds me out. And, it's one thing to appreciate and enjoy the film, but sometimes it just comes across to me like, you just really want to like something. This thing has a very unique strain. By all means, do what you're going to do, have fun. But at the same time, I don't see a lot of value here. Like, I don't see a lot that this adds to anything except for people's personal enjoyment, which is good enough, obviously. Yeah. I just, I think this kind of movie's been done better plenty of times since.
It is certainly one of those movies that's really taken on a life of its own, like the conversation around it. And I do get that sense sometimes with certain movies where with certain people's reaction to certain movies, I should say, where it doesn't ironically seem like it's coming from a sincere place. So it's almost as if they're not even really understanding what it is that they're latching onto. So that is so funny that to hear that story, though, because especially considering that this story, which we've barely mentioned the plot, it barely matters, but suffice it to say that it's kind of the basic overarching narrative of it is that it's this conservative, straight-laced couple falling into this sort of den of mania, of the kind that they've never experienced, of liberation and things of that nature. And they kind of get their entire world just turned upside down. And so that is so funny to hear that this specific person, this conservative man, latched onto it so much. So
yeah, I wanted to bring that up as well.
Yeah, you never know about someone.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you at all, but I wanted to bring that up to John's point of like, because this movie is so I mean, and John had already mentioned, it's so countercultural that it's just like shocking that somebody with that viewpoint would like really take to it when it's like completely taken over the piss of that archetype, which, by the way, for the stage show, when they have people act out as Brad and Janet, they're addressed as asshole and slut through the entire show.
Like it says that on their costume or something?
No, it doesn't say that. Like, that's how the audience addresses them. Like, when they're like, okay, we need somebody to play Brad and Janet. Okay. And they like do like a faux marriage ceremony. And they're like, okay, you're going to commensurate. And we're going to commensurate the ceremony here between what I just said by their names. But I did want to bring a point to John's point, because I totally understand. I understand the sort of like this movie being an identity to people, because I truthfully, I said I mentioned it probably like mid high school, but like I put it off for a while because, like one of my best friends is obsessed with this movie, and I was, I wasn't a theater kid, but I was like theater kid adjacent, just from the standpoint of, like, I mean, I went to a small school, so like the theater teacher was also the journalism teacher, and I was in the school newspaper. So it's like there was a lot of like overlap in circles there. But like that, like I knew people who would go to this, like, if not every weekend, every other weekend. And so I just kind of put it off. So I understand that sort of like impulse to reject, but like I mentioned on the second time, I thought, oh, it was great. I mean, and, for lack of a better term, just kind of gave myself to absolute pleasure, as the movie says. Like, it's hard to resist it. But I do. But the other thing I will at least like concede to, I do think the first half is stronger. I don't think it would be difficult to deny that. And that's something I hear a lot of, have heard around, like the second half loses steam, or the second half isn't quite as strong. And I don't think I could disagree with that. It still has enough charm to carry me through to the end. It feels like, the opening number is science fiction double feature. It pretty much feels like that. The first half is like the mania. The second half is where it really dips into the science fiction territory. And that really, it's like you're either on board with the climax of this movie, or you're like, if you're not, it's going to really turn you off. So like, I totally get that either way.
Yeah. I think it's very telling that in our conversation about the Rocky Horror Picture Show, we've talked very little about the actual content of the movie itself. So I just want to say a few things that I really latched onto, having just watched it kind of as a movie. Everything that you're saying about the pacing is correct. There's definitely a bit of a lull as it goes on, but weirdly enough, I found myself like not even really thinking about that. I just was able to kind of concede to the movie and say like, yeah, they probably are aware of that. They probably don't really care. And I just love the performances and the comedy in it. And the thing that made me laugh the most, and I don't know why, and I have a feeling this will change every single time, but it's when it's a scene that's been, variations on it have been done countless times, but there's this moment of revelation and everyone's like saying each other's names to each other, and like, they're saying Frank, Susan, or what's his name? Brad, Janet,
Magenta.
And then every time Tim Curry says Rocky, it cuts to the monster, and without saying a word, just pivots his head in the funniest way. I could not get enough of it. And I didn't do any research, but it looks like it's even the exact same shot. Like they're just clearly recycling, and it goes on for a while, like 45 seconds maybe, and I lost my mind at that. I'm not sure why exactly, but just that reaction shot of saying nothing but turning reproachfully is fantastic.
Any good like reaction profile shots, like, or good, like I always think of that scene in Election when they find the two ballots that were thrown away, and it just cuts to everybody's disapproving face at Mr. McAllister. It's great.
That is really great. And I just want to give a quick shout out to costume designer Sue Blanc, whose work cannot be praised enough in this movie. So I think we talked a lot about this. I think we're going to wind down again, because we could go on and on about the legacy of this movie and everything, but there's only so much we can cover in one podcast. So, John, we might as well is there anything that you want to say that you didn't get to say before?
Sure. I'll clarify one thing, because I did take a little bit of a shot at a certain segment of the fandom that I think sort of like adopts this movie in sort of a shallow fashion. But I do want to put more attention on everybody else, because I do think that I think it was Roger Ebert who actually said this, to the effect of like, the fans of Rocky Horror Picture Show have made this thing better than it actually was. I think it's something along the lines of like, the fans put on a better show than anything you actually like watched, to paraphrase what he said. And I think that really rings true. I think like, I do appreciate its underdog nature. The fact that it started out as a failure and then people just identified with it in a meaningful way of like, they saw themselves as aliens, you know? And so it's hard to look down on something like that. I can just say that it's just not something that like I can sit through and enjoy from start to finish, despite the movie having, I think there is like one line I remember from it. I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, did something happen to Brad, or did you do something to Brad? And he's like, no, but should I? Amen. 5 stars for that.
Okay.
One of my favorite reviews of this, somebody said, the T in LGBTQ plus stands for this movie.
The actual phrase, this movie.
Yeah.
That's
I
funny.
forget which critic said that. Is pretty funny. But I appreciate this movie. I'm just not a personal fan.
Yeah, that's fine. This is it's strange how this has come up on a variety of comedies that we've discussed. First Young Frankenstein, and now this. What's the deal, John?
Yeah, it's every time we're like, something monster movie or Frankenstein comes up, you're like, well, call
from the
John.
from the mid 70s too. Listen, John.
It's starting to feel a little intentional, Sam.
Oh, now it's going to be intentional. It
Now
was
you're
a
on the hot
coincidence
seat.
up until then. I always have been, and I like it here. And so, yeah, Ryan Oliver, take us out. What are your final thoughts on this movie, if that's even possible?
Oh, I mean, I think I've laid it out there pretty, I feel like I hog the oxygen on this one a little bit, but, I feel like I've said, my piece. Like I said, it's to me, one of the most just purely enjoyable movies. It's like, the kind of, it's a perfect rainy day movie, even though I really just, save it for October, which, I mean, I live in Seattle, so it rains here all the time. So I guess that's totally, makes it a perfect rainy day movie.
The system.
But, exactly. But no, I adore this movie. Obviously it's got its, it's got its cult, it's got its fandom, it's iconic. It's one of those movies where even if you haven't seen it, you've seen it, sort of thing. Like it's just in the pop culture lexicon, but I think it's for good reason. So yeah, it's, if you somehow haven't seen it, I highly recommend.
Yeah. It's having only just seen it for the first time yesterday. I totally concur with that. I think just sort of let it wash over you. And I know that's kind of just a perfunctory thing that critics and podcasters say, but really just understand that it is what it is. That's kind of all I can really say.
Just let it happen. Just,
just let it happen.
Let it happen. Even if you're shivering with anticipation.
But wait, anticipate.
John, I swear to God, you would be the worst person to see this with. Oh my, for a variety of reasons. Well, speaking of anticipations, it's finally time, and I'm fascinated to see how this goes. We're going to do our recommendations, and I think I'll go first with this one because I thought of this moments before starting this podcast, and I found out, actually doing a little bit of research, Sue Blanc, or Blank perhaps, I actually don't know, the costume designer, or excuse me, no, Sue Blaine, my apologies for that, who the costume designer for that, I found out that she also designed costumes for Mick Jagger around the same time, which reminded me of a movie I watched recently that is kind of unlike anything I've ever seen, and I do not even know how to explain or sell it. Have either of you ever seen Nicholas Roeg's Performance?
No, that's been a huge blind spot. I'm not going to lie, though. When you said Mick Jagger, I thought you were going to say Free Jack, and I was going to be very, very confused. But no, I haven't seen that, and I need to.
I think it may have been expiring from the Criterion Channel or something. I just watched it for whatever reason a couple of months ago.
Haven't we talked about this before, Sam? I feel like we
don't recall, but that seems to be a recurring thing on this podcast. Vague memories of things we might have talked about. So maybe that'll come to the surface as I describe it. But the reason it made me think of that movie, it's because it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of free loving attitude as Rocky Horror, nor does it have any sort of sci-fi slant, but it does have a bit of a psychedelic slant, and it's certainly a very kind of stranger in a strange land person winds up in a mysterious house and their life is changed forever kind of story. It's about a businessman who, through a variety of very strange circumstances that I can't quite remember, winds up in the house of Mick Jagger, who's sort of this enigmatic stoner character. And what follows is just this trippy, what the hell is going on? Will I ever get out of here? What is this place movie? And it features one of the most awesome musical numbers I've ever seen, and I have no idea why it's in the movie. Like, it makes no sense, and it's a movie that, as you could probably tell, I can't even describe, but it reminded me, Rocky Horror reminded me so much of it in hindsight, and I think just for the what the hell factor, I think it's the perfect movie to go along with it. So that is my recommendation if you can find it. I know it's not the most readily available thing, but if you can, check out Nicholas Roeg's performance. Ryan, why don't you give one of your other two recommendations, and then John, you do yours, and then we'll go back to Ryan.
Oh, yeah, sure thing. So I'll start with my first one. I already mentioned Showgirls, and then, like you said, we'll do the other one. But going back a year before Rocky Horror Picture Show, have either of you seen Phantom of the Paradise? Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise?
Dang it. No, but I've been meaning to for so long.
Oh yes, it is. It is wonderful, and I think it's definitely as much as Rocky Horror has that that pull in popular culture. I do think Phantom of the Paradise, for all intents and purposes, is a better film. I mean, they're a little bit apples and oranges. I mean, they're both rock operas. They're both kind of like campy and funny. But I really love Phantom of the Paradise. A really great villainous turn from Paul Williams, Jessica Harper from Suspiria in it as well. Like I highly recommend the movie. It's
on Hulu.
It is on Hulu.
I feel like I just saw it on there. Yeah.
That's funny that you bring up Jessica Harper, who plays the Susan Sarandon character in the sequel to Rocky Horror, Shock Treatment. I also watched that yesterday. Not a big fan. I didn't get into it. I've
actually never seen it. I feel like I should, just to say that I did at some point, but that's a bummer that it's not good.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to find. It's just weird. It comes across as weirdly subdued by comparison, so it's hard to be a sequel to Rocky Horror. So I'll cut it some slack, but yeah, it's a bit of a strange one. John, did you have a recommendation for a movie you don't like, perhaps one that you do like?
Okay, I have two, actually, because look, I said before that I think other movies have done this better, and I think Ryan kind of touched on that too, I guess. But there's a movie that I think does a better job in the musical department, kind of a mix of like the musical nature of it and sort of being about weirdos. And there's another movie that I think is a better camp movie, and I'll start with the one. You know how every time on Twitter somebody's like, "What's your unpopular movie opinion? Are you brave?" I'm never brave. I never give this opinion out. This is the Twitter opinion though that I'm going to give away because I've disappointed so many listeners with my opinions so far. So might as well end on a bad note. I think Moulin Rouge is better than Rocky Horror Picture Show. I think it's a better musical. I think it's a better movie about weirdos, which I get some people will look at sort of like the hetero relationship in Moulin Rouge and question my sanity. That's totally true in one sense. But I do think as a jukebox musical, and if Will Ashton could hear me now, considering his hatred of jukebox musicals, I just think this, first of all, the cabaret nature of it is intact from Rocky Horror. But then also just like this feeling of like it's a production. It's such a better film, I think, of taking a stage production and making it cinematic. There are a lot of movies that have done this pretty well. Moulin Rouge is just one of them. And I think that it's a little bit closer, similar DNA in the sense that it's so zippy and weird. And it does have similar problems where the second half isn't as strong as the first. But I think the music is so much better that I forgive a lot of those limitations. Also, sure, this doesn't have Tim Curry. That is very unfortunate, but it does have Jim Broadbent. So just putting that out there. I can feel Ryan Oliver just like
I
typing
heard
up
Ryan,
a restraining order.
I heard Ryan audibly sigh
shortly
after you mentioned Moulin Rouge. It was.
To be fair, there was once upon a time where I did like that movie, but upon a rewatch, maybe a few years ago, I highly respect your opinion there because I know that movie is beloved. So
I rewatch it all the time, and I get it. I totally get why people roll their eyes at this. It's Oscar bait to the extreme. I recognize all this weirdness.
Baz Luhrmann we're not simpatico. But again, sure. Sorry not to interrupt over you. I get it. I know it's beloved and there's definitely merit to it for sure.
It's weird. I have similar reservations with Baz Luhrmann, but that's it. That's a different discussion for a different day. The other movie I was going to mention though, that I think it's probably my favorite camp movie. So, if you want to watch something that sort of satisfies that satirical itch alongside Rocky Horror, then I got to put out the ultimate camp movie, Wet Hot American Summer, another 2001 film, which, okay, I know what you're thinking, John, that's not that clever. Camp, it's a camp movie. You suck. But
that is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
But come on, it's Wet Hot American Summer. It is such a who cares if this movie makes money kind of movie. And I just think it's so like, this is the kind of cult film I personally get behind really easily. It is just so absolutely hilarious in every single way. It never loses steam for me, constantly surprising me in ways that are entertaining. And I just think everybody in the cast is good, not just one person or maybe two, but like every single person here has like their own comedic slant. And so it's like, to me, it's endlessly rewatchable. I would go see Wet Hot American Summer at a midnight screening, like anytime for sure. But it's just not the same for other films. And I think there, if you like Rocky Horror and you want to kind of see something else that maybe gets into that same like personality of liking something, this is one of those movies, I think.
Good to know. It's been a long time since I've seen this, and I don't remember feeling passionate one way or the other about it. But I also wasn't tuned in to the glory that could be found in cult movies, so I'll be curious to rewatch that.
And hey, unlike Rocky Horror, the follow-up is just as good, if not better. The prequel series.
That's certainly not an easy thing to do. So I'm curious about that.
I rewatch that movie probably at least once a year. I love it. It's great.
Well, just like that, we got back along, and
we did.
Everything is right with the
briefly apart, and then came back together. So
there you go.
Like another David Wayne movie.
Let's do the time warp again. And Ryan, why don't you take us out on your final recommendation?
Oh God. Okay. So this is going to be a little bit out there.
That's what I love. That's what I like to hear.
And the reason being is because this movie is terrible. And I know that this movie is terrible. It is absolutely terrible, but I guess I'll just say it and then I'll say my point. It's Cats. And the reason
I knew it. I had a feeling.
And the reason I say that, again, yes, it's terrible. And I don't think it's ever going to have like the reevaluated as being good the way Rocky Horror did.
God, I
because
hope not.
No, it shouldn't. It doesn't deserve it. But I truly think when theaters reopen and can be to the capacity that they once were pre-COVID, I think Cats is going to be one of the next like midnight experiences. I think it's going to be like more probably akin to The Room But it's going to be that type of thing where there's going to be a bunch of stuff to shout at the screen. They're going to have people acting out parts. I'm sure there's going to be props that people, I mean, they were kind of already doing that. Yeah. Weren't there like rowdy screenings of Cats? Like,
yeah, I was just about to mention that. I work at a theater myself, and I'll have you know that even back in like February, I think we were having that exact thing. We were having rowdy screenings, and they sold out. Like, it was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think
Scott Wampler, like, didn't he like rent out a party bus or something off of?
I think he lost a bet to Phil Noble, and he did do that. Yes, but but I truly think, like, you know, that and good or bad, I think the way we consume media and just the way that, you know, because everything's treated so much like content as opposed to actual like film, and so that I feel like that sort of chance that Rocky Horror had to be a cult hit, I don't know. Can anything be a cult hit anymore? Like, what does that even like mean in this sort of current like cinematic landscape? I don't know. So I think it's just rare whether the movie is, you know, secretly great or an absolute dumpster fire. That's something.
Oh, it's the second one.
Oh, it's definitely the second one for this case. I'm just saying it's rare that thing can still happen.
Yeah.
And so I tend to latch on to that, even if, you know, like we said, even if the movie's a dumpster fire, which Cats is, but I've seen it 3 times now. I don't know what that says about me as a person, but I found it to be incredibly entertaining every single time with the people that I've watched it with. So, I mean, mostly virtually, but hey, you know, it's still been a good time. So I think that's going to be one of the next midnight experiences. So I don't recommend it on like its own merit, but if you want to be ahead of the curve of something that's going to hopefully be an experience later down the road and you haven't seen it, it might be worth checking out.
That is very good to know. Yeah. Cats is weird because it's the kind of thing that like almost never happens. It's kind of unprecedented where something this weird and something this kind of hard to even comprehend got this much of a budget. Like, they threw money at that thing, and it's really crazy. And I'm glad that it right out of the gate, it was viewed as exactly what it is, which is a weird damn thing that deserves to be looked at as side-eyed as possible. So I totally see where you're coming from.
It happens. I mean, it really only happens when you get a filmmaker, you know, a carte blanche filmmaker who's completely out of their element, which, I mean, Tom Hooper's previous movies have all been Oscar winners. I was going to say not just nominees, but winners, and they've all been financially successful. So it's sort of, you know, bought him clout to, you know, one of the most successful Broadway musicals, but, you know, special effects, not really in that guy's wheelhouse. And
yeah,
it shows.
I'd also say stories too. And
that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. And even after that, like, visual effects patch that they did, I'm not even convinced that was real. I think that was a hoax to just get more audience members into the theater, but who knows?
For sure.
Yeah. And so with that, I think that might be our show. It was a bit of a long one, longer than we usually do, but I think we talked about 2 really big important ones, and I'm glad that we got to get into so much detail and from so many different angles as well across all sides of the cinephile experience, and I look forward to hearing others as well. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to getting to speak with you again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun, and thank you, and hope to be on sometime in the near future.
Absolutely. And John, you're my boss, so I don't need to tell you how grateful I am for everything, but know that it is much appreciated. I knew it.
Sorry. Whoa, this has been a long one. Wow, I just nodded off there. I didn't hear anything you said.
It has been a long one. I know you're a busy man, so I think we will sign off. You know where to find us. Our social media is in the show notes of this episode. We're all over the interwebs, all 3 of us. And with that, we will say our final goodbyes from Transylvania. Let's say I'm Sam Noland.
From a gate in the outskirts of town where the three of us are pontificating existence, I'm Frank and John. There.
5 stars. I love it.
And from the outer reaches of whatever world that Riff Raff is from, I am Ran Oliver.
And we will see you on the next Extra Milestone.